Ben, I'm hitting start webinar and it doesn't seem to be starting it.
Emma, si puedes quitar tu imagen.
Could you give me host control?
Sure.
Okay, I'll be starting it now.
Welcome, everyone, and Happy New Year. It's hard to believe it's 2022, but we are thrilled you have returned. Our first timer for our series that we at Share Our Strength and Food and Society at the Aspen Institute are very proud of, the Conversations on Food Justice series. Thanks as always to our Aspen partners, Corby Kummer, Executive Director of Food and Society at the Aspen Institute, who you'll hear from later, and Mary Castile. And also all my wonderful colleagues at Share Our Strength, our internal working group, and especially Wendy Katbagan, Monica Gonzalez, and my partner, Julie McNulty. We're happy today to have Spanish language translation provided by our friends from Community Language Collaborative. They will be providing live simultaneous interpretation and chat transcription. You can access audio options by clicking the interpretation icon found at the bottom of your screen. Then select your language preference. You can also view on YouTube via the link we'll put in the chat. We'll also have about 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of the discussion, so please feel free to add any questions or comments in the chat. There's an old sentiment that says, just because you don't see something happening doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. What we hope to do today is share with you a bit about the unseen, extraordinary stories of the migrant farming community. A community that is powerfully resilient, hardworking, and inspiring. A community that is in essence ensuring that the American family is fed, but who are themselves deeply exploited, vulnerable, and under constant threat. You'll also hear from some extraordinary leaders who are forging a new vision for an agricultural industry that values the land and the people who tend to it. I'd now like to introduce our esteemed panel. We'll put their full bios in the chat so you can learn more about their incredible work. First, I'd like to introduce Miley Trevino Salcida. Executive Director and co-founder, Alianza Nacional de Campesinas. Haley, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank
Next.
you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Paku Hang, who is the Executive Director of the Hmong America's Farmers Association. Paku, thanks for joining us. I'd like to also welcome Greg Aspett, co-founder of the Coalition of Immocular Workers. Greg. And Emma Torres, the founder and chief executive officer of Campesinos Sin Fronteras. Thanks, Emma. Finally, we are thrilled to have Russell Contreras, the justice and race reporter at Axios, serve as our esteemed moderator. Axios is committed to smart news and is dedicated to helping ensure the world is informed with accurate, honest, and clear information. Very much in line with our values. Thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you to all of our panels and for everybody for joining us. Russell, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Elliot, and thank you to the organizers, the Aspen Institute, for putting together this panel, this discussion. I'm coming at you from Rio Rancho, New Mexico, right next to Santa Ana Pueblo and Zia Pueblo, and right here on native land in the great state of New Mexico. To start off with, I want to bring us, take us back 60 years, more than 60 years ago. Edward R. Morrow took Americans into the lives of campesinos and farm workers, migrant farm workers, right before John F. Kennedy took office. Eisenhower was about to leave the White House, and for an hour, he brought us into the homes, he brought into our homes the lives of migrant farm workers on Thanksgiving. Like the Jodes and the grapes of wrath, the people he covered followed the crop. And we got into a moment, the lives of these people and what they are doing every day to provide food to Americans. If we were to go back 60 years ago and look at the conditions then and compare them to now, we may have better technology. We may have better methods to distribute food. But in many cases, the conditions of those workers have changed very little. We're going to be talking about that and what the people here on the panel are doing to address the inequality in terms of food security, the people that provide food security, and the people that provide the food security, what their food security is. To start off with, I want to start with Miley. Take us into the world of migrant farm workers, our farm workers in general today. What are their conditions like in living in their homes? What are their housing challenges?
There are many, many challenges, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. Thank you for inviting and for the question. We have worked a lot. I'm in California, and in California, of course, there's been a lot of advancement in terms of housing conditions, but the situation of farm workers, we keep having workers that are mobilizing, migrating, not as much as before, but the conditions is where we still have 2-3 families living together just to make sure so that they can be able to survive. The wages are so low, it's very, very hard for them to be able to pay rent, very high rents in California. And because we're an organization that works with 15 different member organizations, we're in 20 different states, we can only say it's everywhere the situations are the same. And the problem is that we do have many families living in shacks, in units that are very substandards, and the government needs to do a lot more work there.
And Emma, along the border, you do have migrants who come from Latin America, or those Mexican Americans, Asian Americans who have worked on the border for many years. What are the conditions there where there are less eyeballs on workers and more exploitation from growers?
Well, going back to housing, we don't have housing here in Arizona. We don't have like farm worker housing or camps. So most of the farm workers, particularly the temporarily H-2A workers, go back to Mexico. They live across the border and then come and every morning. So they commute, they cross the border, and their commute starts at 12 midnight, because they have to come. They have to make a 3-hour line to come and be here early in the morning to be able to pick up their bus at 4 or 5 a.m. So what they do, they come across, and we don't have shelters or housing across the border for them. So they sleep on the ground. They sleep on a corner of a bank. They just bring a blanket and they try to sleep at least for a few hours before they go on their bus. Then they sleep a little bit more on their transportation while they're being taken to the fields. So they, I can easily and say and very securely that I don't think they sleep more than 4 hours during the season, because they go in the afternoon, they go back to Mexico and they make a line to go back to Mexico. And sometimes their day ends at 6 or 7 p.m. So by the time they get home, it might be 9. They just have something to eat. They might take a shower or try to sleep for a little bit, a couple of hours, and then come back. So it's very, they don't have the security of a home like we do.
And Greg, one of the things I remember from the Edward Morrow documentary in 1960 was that opening scene. It seemed like an auction of human beings. It was that constant growers looking and asking for folks to come and work, and this is what I'm paying, almost like the trafficking of humans. And the documentary focused on Florida, and that setting, and even today, still upsets me because it gives me anguish just to watch it unfold. If you are a worker, how do you deal with some of those images and some of those mental health challenges, especially in a place like Florida, where workers may not know where their income's coming from and there's no job security? What's going on in terms of the workers with mental health?
Well, it is interesting. You mentioned Harvest of Shame, and it was filmed in Immokalee, in part, in the town where our organization was born. And that shape up, they call it, the getting of work in the morning, going out to the public parking lot and just basically asking for work everywhere you can. All the buses are there, and the crew leaders are there, choosing the workers they want to take to the field that day. That still goes on, outside of the Fair Food program that we are part of building. But so that same sort of desperation for daily labor is still sort of the basic dynamic for workers every day in the fields in this country. You ask about mental health, and when you think about anyone's mental health, especially when it's environmentally challenged, it has to do with your feeling of powerlessness or power to control the conditions you live in, right? If you're facing extreme exploitation, if you're facing sexual harassment at work every day, if you're facing humiliation at work every day, even physical violence, and you have no control over that, you have no way of stopping that from happening, and you take that home to your family, if you have your family here with you, you take that home to your family every night. You can't interact with your children the way you'd like to. You can't sleep the way you'd like to. That builds up over time. So a lot of the mental health problems that the workers do encounter ultimately are rooted in that powerlessness that defines the relationship of farm workers to their employers in the vast majority of agriculture in the country today.
And Paku, we have this narrative in the United States that erases Asian Americans, and especially in our farming history. We fail to realize that Cesar Chavez was pushed to start his strike with the help of Filipino workers. And in fact, they're the ones that pushed him over. Today, there are Asian Americans working in the fields in Central California and in Minnesota. Can you talk about how refugee farmers are uniquely situated in our nation's food system? And what goes on for especially, Asian American workers in places like Minnesota, where we tend to ignore that they even exist and what they're doing?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Russell, for asking me a really important question. I also want to thank Elliot and Julie and Wendy and Corby and all of you for engaging in such a critical conversation that we're having. Russell, like Russell said, my name is Pa Kuhing, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Hmong American Farmers Association. We are a farmer-centered membership-based organization that works to build wealth for Hmong farmers in Minnesota. And while our immediate issues might be slightly different from migrant workers or field workers, the search for dignity of work and the search to own our own labor is the same. And relative to your question, refugee farmers face many challenges. Some of the immediate challenges are access to land long-term, their access to other markets besides, let's say, a farmer's market, access to training and to research, and access to credit and capital. And all of this is really bundled under the fact that farmers and field workers are not paid the true cost of food. It's our labor is subsidizing someone else's profit because the hours that we spend, the labor that we put into growing and harvesting and delivering food is not really compensated. And I want to share quickly a story. When we first started HAFA, we wanted to really reach out and support food shelves. And so we went to the food shelf administrators and we said, we have these amazing farmers. We want to sell our vegetables to your food shelves. And they said, oh, that's fantastic. And we said, well, how much will you pay for this food? And they said, well, we'll pay 20 cents for a pound of carrots. And I remember thinking, my farmers can't even buy seeds for 20 cents a pound. And my response was, how dare we trade one poverty for another? And that's really at the heart of it, is the struggle is that we don't own our own labor, and that this country is not willing to pay the true cost of food. And that's why we have such exploitation.
And staying on you, Baku, on the notion of exploitation, we also have to deal with climate change. Minnesota is right there on the border. We assume, yes, you get a lot of snow, but when you don't get enough snow, that affects snowpack and water. When there's drought, there's less food, there's less work. How has climate change affected the workers where you live?
Climate change has drastically affected the certainty and uncertainty that our farmers face. And it's not just like you said, Russell, is there enough water in our soil, right? Or in our aquifers? It's also the vexillation. We might have a rainstorm that dumps 20 inches of rain. And then for 4 weeks, we won't have any rain. And especially for small farmers, like the farmers that I'm working with, if a tornado comes in or a rainstorm comes in and it takes out 3 acres, that's 3 acres out of only 10 acres. That's 30% of their production. It is every year we are seeing more and more farmers leave farming because, farming is already uncertain, but climate change, exacerbates that uncertainty. And then on top of that, just the conditions, and I think many of my peers on this panel can attest to this, just the working conditions, the heat waves. Sometimes now you get into the fields, and this is in Minnesota, it's 100 degrees. Our farmers, many of them are older, just can't sustain those type of working conditions.
Yeah, Russell, if I might add to that, to the condition of these heat waves that are getting worse and worse every summer, are absolutely a crisis, a health crisis for farm workers who are on the front lines of climate change. And one of the things we've been able to do with the Fair Food Program, which is a program that enforces human rights in the fields by harnessing the purchasing power of major buyers in the food industry, is to add new regulations to the program, to the code of conduct about heat stress, including mandatory every 2 hours cool down breaks and the right to take out and step out of the fields anytime you feel like you might be getting dizzy or you might be getting sick from the heat, because the heat absolutely can knock you out from 1 minute to the next. 110, 115 degrees in the sun is nothing abnormal for farm workers, and it's been getting worse and worse. And even the people in the best of condition can find themselves disoriented and on the ground before they even know it. So it's absolutely essential. We have people dying from heat stress in the fields every year in this country. Uncounted numbers, but dozens. And so it's really essential that workers have the power to be able to actually step out of the fields when they feel sick, and also have these mandatory breaks and water and shade in the fields, which are not part of law, really, in most places in the country. So that's really got to be the answer. Again, it comes back down to power. It comes down to changing those underlying power dynamics and giving workers the ability to protect themselves as frontline monitors of their own rights.
And Greg, the Florida also has
Russell, let me-
pollution problems.
Yeah.
And we have when the sugar canes come out, it pollutes towns. It gets almost black soot and it's a black snow. I want to go to you, Emma, because when we talk about climate change, yes, the border also is on the front line of climate change, but also pollution. That's not we're creating food. Sometimes the way we're have marketed and we're trying to preserve it, farm workers are facing some very difficult working conditions with pollution. And we're not just talking about pesticides. We're talking about smoke. We're talking about, even there in El Paso, if Segundo Barrio is right near all the trafficking and the fumes. What are farm workers on the border facing with pollution?
Well, as it's been discussed, unfortunately, despite of the situation, either the pesticides and the pollution, waiting for 3 hours while all this line of cars and everything is coming across. And then remember, I'm on the Mexico border, so Mexico doesn't have a lot of regulations in burning tires, and there's a lot of pollution. Then we're also in a desert area, so there's a lot of dust all the time. So we are definitely exposed to, and our farm workers are, double impacted on either side by this situation. And then in Arizona, it's no news that we endure temperatures of 115 degrees sometimes. But even then, we learn to live with that. But then because of this climate change, it has gotten to 120, 125 degrees. So it's really like where we're seeing a lot of heat stroke, heat stress. So, that's something that we try to really ensure that the workers know of their labor rights, that they are, they're feeling sick, they can go out of the field, not be afraid of losing their contract or their work, because they walk out and they stop working, they may lose their contract. And a lot of them, suffer from heat stress. And then in order to not, lose their contract, they go back across the border to try to get some medical support. So there's no history of what the situation is going on here. So the former or whomever hires them, the contractor, is not responsible for helping them deal with that. So there's a lot of that dynamics of, power, like we've been discussing, powerless and power about, they know what they need to do in order to keep a job. They live on a daily basis. They don't have like a secure job that will pay them even if they get sick or not. If they work, they get paid. If they don't, they don't. And they live on a day-to-day wages. So it is very, very sad to see that a lot of them will endure, labor situations that none of us would, because they don't want to lose their job.
Miley, Emma talks about the power situation and contracts. And we know whenever there's power, campesinas are the ones who are going to be the most exploited in this. And the book by Tomas Rivera, The Art of Not Swallowing, you do see some of this. Women are getting paid less, and then told to also monitor child labor, children who are working in the fields. What are you seeing in terms of the challenges that immigrant women and migrant workers who are female facing in the fields as compared to men? Are they also being exploited? Are they seeing things, and are they seeing worse conditions from where you stand?
Well, there's so many different things that are happening in general in terms of how our compañeras are sharing right now. To start with, let me just say, there's no health benefits for farm workers. So there's no medical plan. So if they get sick, housing issues, work issue, and we're not even part of the Fair Labor Standards Act. That tells you how much racism there still exists. Not being part of the Fair Labor Standards Act, that means that we're not part of the National Labor Relations Board, which workers cannot come up and say, oh, I've been injured or I want to organize, because you get fired and there's no protections. Then for farm worker women, there's many, many other issues that are happening, including being harassed, assaulted, and raped. And because we have a large percentage, which are more than 60%. People say it's 50% of undocumented people. No, it's more than 60% of farm workers are undocumented. Who are the first ones to know that you're undocumented? The ones that hire you, the ones that they know where you have to write in the information, where you live, everything else. And they get to know your family. So if you're complaining, the first thing they're going to tell you, you're going to be not only fired, you're going to be threatened that immigration is going to come, and not only to take you, but to take your family. So people not having any kind of recourse or resources or any kind of support, of course, they're going to be quiet. They're going to be silent. They're going to be powerless. And farm worker women, we have found, I mean, Emma and I are very strong characters, but at the same time, let me just say this. If it happened to me, I'm very strong, and I say things how they are. Believe me, because of our tradition in terms of taboos or myths, you're going to be blamed whatsoever. We don't, at the beginning, we don't say it, but then it becomes worse. Why? If you're going to be harassed or raped, we have found that 9 out of 10 women have been sexually harassed at least once in agriculture. And 5 out of 10 women have been assaulted, and 3 out of 10 women have been raped. And this is just one area. And in terms of what happens with our reproductive system, it has been found that by working in agricultural fields, because of the use of pesticides and misuse of pesticides, children are born with abnormalities or special needs. But what's happening with women's reproductive system? None of that is, I mean, there's a lot of things that are lacking. There's so many different things that are happening. And the majority of the time, the best way to keep people silent and be exploited and marginalized is by being threatened. As I just said, there's many other things that maybe Emma or Greg can share, or Pacao, you can share so many different things that we as women go through. And it's so much. It's every single week we hear women complaining about not only that they're being harassed, not only by the crew leader, the supervisor, the owner, and maybe some coworkers. And it's a thing. It became common, and that's very unhealthy. At the same time, if you don't have someone, if you don't have health insurance, and that's the other part, you don't have health insurance and you're sick, or you're working people at extreme levels of temperatures and not giving the shade. I mean, what's going on with women? I mean, there's all these different things that are happening, and none of this is said. And we try to have conversations, and at the same time, people are afraid to talk because they're afraid to not be given a job at the next season or the following. Yeah.
And I want to stay with you on this. On that note, I keep thinking of all the women who were involved in the farm workers movement and speaking out. And every time they did, there was always a man who said, "Oh, she's a loudmouth," or she's creating too much of a storm, even though the man would say exactly the same thing when they were in front of a committee. On that note, are we seeing more campesinas step up in leadership positions now in 2022, that they're saying, I've got to speak out, not just for myself, but my fellow workers? Is there now a seismic shift in the way we're seeing women really step up in leadership?
Yes, we've seen that a lot. This is why at the same time, when we started creating the National Alliance, which was more than 10 years ago, at the same time, we started a movement in 30-some years ago. I always say I was 5 years old. No, just kidding. But it's about how we learned. Yes, we were involved as part of the United Farm Workers here in California. We learned how important it was for us women to start joining, not only make changes in the workplace, but then we started learning that we could also make changes, not only within the workplace, but in our community. The situation of violence against women also in the home, which is called domestic violence. All these situations are opening the dialogue and breaking the cycles of violence. All these things have come into place. We have become to the point very key in terms of speaking for our families, speaking for ourselves. Alianza Nacional de Campesinas is representing more than 750,000 farm worker women. We're in 20 different states. And we have seen that the more information we get, the more we learn that we have options. The more information we get, the more we learn, not only because we have options, how we can support each other. And then how can we pressure agencies to really respond to how they're supposed to be treating our community and be working within the cultural context of our people, not just saying that they're there to assist and waiting for us. We bring them to where people live. We have taught them that the best way to really give service is going to where families are, because the majority do not have transportation, the majority do not have health benefits, the majority do not. People are still earning $7.25 an hour. What does that mean? It's only women, farm worker women, and I will challenge the government. Farm worker women are earning less than $13,000 a year. That's way below poverty. And if men are earning between 17 and 21,000 a year, you can imagine women are also in hiding. We found in Florida and upstate New York and parts of Oregon and some areas in California that women are working many more times with their partners or significant others. And you know what? Because many of them are undocumented, you know what happens when it's piece rate? Only one Social Security is used. Who do you think takes a check? The men. So less women are counted for. So there's many more in hiding. There's many more issues that are there.
Russell, if I could just add to all that, because everything you've heard is absolutely true across the country, right? The abuses, many of which are even crimes, are happening to farm workers every day, right? But so you ask, why is that? Like, why can't that stop? Why can't workers keep that from happening, right? And it goes back to the question of power, right? So just imagine yourself, if you stepped out of your house and you got jumped in the street, right? And had your money stolen, as if it were your wages, had your money stolen. If you thought, if I go to the cops, I'm going to get beaten again, and it's going to get worse for me, and they're not going to put the guy in jail, or the person who did it to him, they're not going to bring justice. So why would you go? You're not going to go to the police, right? That's exactly the situation for farm workers. Essentially, is that there is no way for most farm workers in this country to report the abuses that are happening to them every day, with the belief that they will be protected when they do. They won't lose their job. They won't get further humiliated or further subjected to violence at work for having complained, and that the person who did it to them will face justice for what they did. That's just the reality. So what you have to do, if you want to see these things end, ultimately, that's why the CIW, the Coalition of Migrant Workers that I work with, that's where we came from. Like the UFW, we came out of a series of strikes back in the 90s, right? And then we were also at the same time fighting to stop these modern day slavery, forced labor operations that were happening all over the place in Florida and along the East Coast. And those are the conditions we were trying to stop simply by by going straight at the crew leaders and the growers we know, and going straight at the abusers who were holding people against their will and trying to get them prosecuted by the Department of Justice and the people who have the power to prosecute. And we had some success doing that. We, in the 90s and early 2000s, we did put 15 farm bosses behind bars for forced labor. But we learned that no matter what, that was just the tip of the iceberg. That successful prosecutions for slavery, for forced labor, don't constitute success in stopping those problems. You have to change, you have to reach prevention, right? If you're trying to help people get back together after having been victims of crime, it's so much harder than if you can just stop the crime from happening in the first place. Because then people don't have to suffer and be victims of that and that sort of thing. And to do that, you have to change the incentives. You have to change the economic world around the actors who do these sorts of abuses. So they know, one, if they do it, they'll get caught. And two, if they're caught, there will be consequences. Once that happens, you can actually not just stop, you cannot just redress the problem after it happens, but you can stop it from happening altogether.
Greg, I want to stay with you before I go back to Paku. You said the word slavery, and I think we tend to think slavery ended in 1865, but you have found it through your anti-slavery program that there has been workers in forced labor situations. Can you describe that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's, chattel slavery is not what we're talking about. Chattel slavery, which was the up till 1869, that was the situation that people think of when they hear slavery. But forced labor, which is defined by the laws that came out after the Civil War, right? Forced labor is the question of being forced to work against your will for little or no pay under the threat or use of violence, right? And there are operations in this country. I'll just give you one example. The last 3 months of 2021, there were headlines in Georgia with a massive operation that was brought to justice by the U.S. Justice Department, the FBI, all kinds of people. In the indictments, they indicted 24 people. They said it involved 70,000 workers in conditions that ranged from being, as Millie was saying, raped repeatedly, to dying from heat, to simply being threatened that if they complained, their families back home in Mexico would be threatened and hurt, right? 70,000 workers who went through those conditions, and $200 million of illegal profits that were laundered through casinos. So that was just one of the cases, the last 3 cases in the last 3 months of 2021, right? That just show you how big business is when you're talking about forced labor in agriculture in this country. And one of the reasons it's become so big is the increasing use of the H-2 program, the guest worker program, which makes it even harder for workers, most workers, to protect themselves because they come into the country under a visa that is essentially held by their employer. Right? And often they incur a debt at home in order to be able to come to the country. And so that debt is held by somebody else back home who knows who their families are. And so they work to pay off the debt once they're here under the threat of harm to their families. Right? So that, when you combine that with the already existing just imbalance of power across agriculture, you find not just extreme exploitation, which is not what we use. We don't use the word modern day slavery or forced labor to describe extreme exploitation. We use the actual forced labor use of violence to keep people from leaving for that term. And we've been involved in more than a dozen prosecutions, and they're not stopping, except through the Fair Food Program, where we have been able to stop it from happening.
Mbaku, question from the audience, and I think this is perfect for you. We're seeing a lot of supply chain issues and increasing prices at grocery stores. How do we balance these challenges with the need to protect farm workers? And I would add, what's on the table of the farm workers? Because they're producing some very healthy food that goes up to Trader Joe's, which it's great for health nuts like myself, who are monitoring our food with our smartwatches and our apps. But can these farm workers afford that food? What's on their table?
Right. So I'll answer that question first, and then I'll answer your first question. So what's on their table often, Russell, if they find the time to eat, it's simple food, because they themselves can't afford, like you alluded to, the expensive food that they're growing. And so, you know, a farmer like my own parents, they will, even though my mom, one of her favorite food is pea blossoms, right? Pea tips. She will take the bulk of what she's grown and she sells it to the restaurants, and she won't even have a little bit for herself because she knows that I have to make rent, right? Or I have to buy the certain types of fertilizers that are organic that I use in my garden, which are very expensive. So oftentimes farmers, because they don't have time and the resources, they're actually eating really unhealthy food. They might be coming home from the farm and picking up a McDonald's because that's what they can afford and that's what's expedient. So unfortunately, it really it's a paradox. But to answer your first question about, you know, what can folks do around supply chain, I think for me, it comes back to what I said before about being comfortable with paying for the true price of food. You know, why do we have the system that we have right now? It's because we have put profit over people. We have put profits over biodiversity in our ecosystems. We have even put profit over our own nutrition, right? Food is actually medicine. When people eat healthy, natural food, they're actually healthier. But we live in a food world where the profit is most important. So we will eat a tomato that has no nutritional value, but it can be grown cheaply, right? And so we have to break that. And I think, I don't think that people are, and consumers are inherently evil. You know, when we hear these stories that Greg or Millie or Emma are alluding to, like, I think the common person is going to be like, yes, that is wrong. But they have to say, yes, that is wrong. At the same time, am I willing to pay more for the food then? And I think that is really the crux of it, that these challenges are systems-based, right? And so because they're systems-based, we don't always see them explicitly. And that's why I think the moment, the call to action is for us as consumers to be more critical, to ask questions about where does this food come from? How is the farmer being treated? You know, is it a local farmer? Am I willing to spend 5 more cents to buy a tomato that's locally grown from an immigrant family than to go to some other restaurant, other grocery store and have it be shipped here from Mexico? So those are the questions and decisions that I think consumers have to make.
And Emma, another question from the audience. Since you're on, you know, you work with folks on the border, what policies at the local, city, and regional levels of government would you like to see enacted so that there's more agency for farm workers and provide more food security for them?
Well, what I would like to see, and I've been, this is something I always discuss with Millie, this individual that cross at midnight and they don't have a place to sleep or even to go to the bathroom. And they're charged by, you know, they have to buy coffee or something in order to use the bathroom. So they just, you know, don't, you know, find a corner or whatever. And I spoke with the mayor about putting some portable parties at least, so for them to have that. So it's like their situation is really dire at any level. This is so complex because you're talking about H2A and women and all that. And what I have seen is with H2A, my agency has worked in helping. We have an immigration program, so we have helped, you know, and company, you know, bring their H2A workers, and we see that. Although very subtle, you know, women are not being recruited. It's mostly men, and that in itself is a discrimination. Absolutely. We know, but it's done in a way that it doesn't look like it is. You know, and the modern slavery, you know, when these individuals are brought, they're between 18 and 36 years old. So they're brought in their best years that they can perform the hard labor they're going to be enduring. And then these individuals don't have like a place. They're mostly single men that come from South Mexico, and they don't have like the wife to cook or the mom to feed them. So they work and they live on Red Bull, you know, which you know, it's like that will give them the energy just to stay alive, you know, awake and with very little nutrition, which really is detrimental to their health, and that's what eventually will create all these mental and health issues. So there's a lot. But one thing I do want to put a plug in here, you know, we are painting such a grim picture of agriculture, and Yuma County, our main industry is agriculture. And I have seen some good, you know, farmers, some people that are very conscious about the situation, and they do their best to help their population. So there's the good, the bad, and the ugly, in the industry. There's not all just bad and ugly. And that's one of the things I do want to say, because I do have worked with throughout my 40, 50 years. I used to work in agriculture. So I know in this community that there are some very conscious, perhaps not as many as we wish, of the growers that, really try to help their workers, just as they are bad that they will abuse the workforce like we're discussing here.
Miley, Emma had a good point about this is not all bad.
Mhm.
There's workers, they still live, they still sing. If you look at the literature, they're falling in love.
Mhm.
What, in spite of all these challenges, how are the workers still able to express joy, and how do they express joy under these circumstances?
We're extremely resilient. We have a health fair that we begin at 1 a.m. in the morning, because that's when they're crossing. And we have music and food, and they sing and they dance. And, I guess we get used to what we have. We make lemonade with lemons, like it said. So we're not like, oh, poor me, no, they have their own culture of survival. And they make fun of each other, and then, but it's acceptable. It's a way of encouraging each other and everything. And it's just incredible how resilient our population is.
And Greg, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I'm just going to say on the consumer question, how important consumers can be. I think most of the major changes for farm workers, the advancements at that systemic level that Paco was talking about, not just the individual, but the things that create systems of forces that keep people in poverty and powerlessness, have been as a result of alliances between workers and consumers, right? Where consumers, because really in the end, the food market is a hierarchical system with the power at the top, right? And so the major buyers can tell the growers what they want in terms of price and quality and all those sorts of things, and particularly price. And then the growers tell the crew leaders, the farm bosses, what they need out of the workers and so forth, right? But what we forget is in the food market, it doesn't end with the major buyers, the Walmarts and McDonald's of the world. It actually ends with us, with consumers. Consumers are the top of the food market. The reason we don't think of it that way is because we usually act individually as consumers. We usually buy only for our own particular ideas. But if we act concertedly, if we act together and boycott or pressure companies that we need to act differently, they will change the way they do business. We know this. It's not just a theory. That's how we built the Fair Food Program, by announcing the Taco Bell boycott 20 years ago to a world that when we told the world Taco Bell makes farm workers poor, people had very little idea of what we were trying to say, right? But we kept working with students and people of faith and unions and everybody across the country until after several years, Taco Bell agreed to condition its purchases on compliance by its suppliers on human rights standards, right? So they would only buy from suppliers who actually met fundamental human rights standards. And that's the same thing that the buyers have done for years with food safety, for example. They've required you to meet certain standards for food safety to sell to them. So once you put the economic incentives around the system and drive that downward, you can actually change the conditions for workers in the fields. Mm. So consumers are key to that, though. The workers alone can't convince these major chains to change the way they do business. They need to hear from the ultimate power in the food market, which is consumers.
There are many reasons why I would tell someone not to buy from the Bell, but that's actually a very good reason.
Yeah.
There's a lot of suggestions that I would go elsewhere. Miley, I want to go to you. Look, a lot of farm workers live in remote areas. They live, in southeastern Colorado, parts of Kansas, really isolated regions on the border. Because they're so remote, how can farm workers get the resources they need, especially when a lot of wealth is concentrated in the cities and away from their base? What can be done to make sure that they have access to the infrastructure and resources?
Well, there's different ways that we have, talking about survival and being able to start, thinking different ways and be strategic about these kind of things. I like when Greg is sharing, the consumer is the one that, and we're all consumers. So it's about being aware, understanding, as you were talking, Russell, and the visibility is what gives you the opportunity to say something. If you're not visible, you can't say anything, no? So yes, because farm workers are very far, they're in very remote areas. What we've done when we started doing with Food Forward, it's just one very, very small example that I'm going to give. Several of our groups have worked with, have started working now with COVID, where I do want to, I'm going to throw in many things. Right now, in terms of women, there was a point that women had to decide when COVID started, either to because there was no childcare, no school, no nothing, decide in terms of caring for their children at home or going to work to sustain the family. That was very hard. That was very, very hard. So when we started going out in dangerous, there were dangerous situations because of COVID, no? But we started going out and we started finding out that there were families with no whatsoever food, even children with no milk. And what we started doing was, hey, try to get, when people were getting the stimulus, hey, convince them to give some of their stimulus so we can buy food for all these families. And then we ended up working with Food Forward from LA and bringing big trucks on a monthly basis or every 2 weeks in different parts around outside of LA. And that means that Food Forward is convincing companies to give food so that some of these families can have some, but then organizing the families themselves in their communities so that they can also help out and take it to families that don't have the transportation, that don't have different ways. Now, the consumer can help in many ways. There can be, push for better legislation where more of these kind of programs be there for fresh fruit and vegetables to be provided to our communities. Not just having food banks getting, canned foods or that, which is not, culturally, it's not what our people eat. There's different ways that we can engage, and maybe I don't know if Paku or Emma can share a little bit more in terms of other ways, but we have organized different activities, and the people from the communities are more than willing because they know what it is to be starving. And throughout part of our culture is to help our neighbor, and we are helping each other. So I don't know if Paku or Emma would want to share a little bit more.
Yeah, I want to go to Paku because now I want to, before we part, I want to give everybody a chance to tell us, what are you doing, your organization doing, and why are you still hopeful for the future? Paku, I'm going to go to you first, and I would also say that on Miley's point, canned tortillas are terrible. I do not recommend them. Also, canned tamales are not very good. What are you guys doing in Minnesota? And why are you still hopeful that things could change in the future?
Sure. So we're doing a couple of things. First of all, we're reimagining our capitalist system. And by that, I mean that we're really focusing on cooperatives, farmer cooperatives, marketing cooperatives, land cooperatives. This is where the people who are doing the work are actually owning their labor and they're getting access to the profits from that labor. That's one thing. And I think in addition to that, around cooperatives, if you're someone who cares about a just food system, don't just go to that big box grocery store. Go to some of the local cooperatives in your neighborhood. If there isn't one, form one, right? Reach out to the farmers and support them to form a cooperative or a CSA, a community supported agriculture, so that the profits are really going back to the people who are most invested in that labor. So that's one of the first things the HAFA is doing. It's really reimagining the way that that workers can own their own labor. The second thing is that these problems are about power and they are about systems. And so because they're about systems, we have to focus on public policy too. And HAFA has been really adamant about advocating at the federal level for reimagining a reconsideration of the farm to school formula. Right now, our children are the ones who need nutritious food the most. And yet sometimes they're getting some of the worst type of food because the farm to school or just the school lunch formula is so degraded, right? It's all about the cheapest type of food. We have to re-examine that and update that formula so that schools who really want to get fresh produce into their systems can do that at a fair price to the farmers, number one. Number two, we also have to look at places where people are gathering and eating food and making sure that good produce is in there. So, hospitals are another place. People are sick. They need that nutritious food. We have to advocate for policy that are supporting and maybe even dictating hospitals to buy locally so they get some of the best produce. And all of that is encompassed in the sense that we have to have people more engaged in the political system. And even though HAFA is all about community wealth and supporting our farmers, one of the biggest programs that we have is registering our farmers and their families to go and vote. And on election day, we take off and we support our farmers to take them. Sometimes we have to interpret them at the polls because we know that at least for our demographic, that is one of the ways that we can assert our power.
Greg, and apologies. We only have about a few seconds left. Can you tell me in 45 seconds what you guys are doing and how people can get involved?
Yeah, the heart of our work is the Fair Food Program. And so if you go to fairfoodprogram.org, you'll learn everything you need to know about it. But what it does, it's a worker-driven, market-enforced human rights program that now for 10 years has been working in Florida. It's expanded to other states and other crops. It's been replicated in other continents and other industries. And it's the only thing that's been proven to work to protect workers' human rights at the bottom of corporate supply chains. And so we deal with some of the biggest food buyers in the world, but it also works for apparel buyers and all the other industries in which it's working. It is a vaccine to all the ills that we have been talking about today that works. And for us, we go to bed at night and we wake up in the morning working to expand that vaccine to the millions of other workers who need it.
Amen. 30 seconds. What are you guys doing?
And for us, we've been working through coalitions. We have a humanitarian coalition. We have a farm worker service coalition. And what we have done now through COVID is identifying where the food is available because our farm workers are migrant. They're mobile. They often don't know the resources in the community. So by ensuring that we know where the resources are and we ensure we get to them and provide them whatever time it is. If it's at 2 a.m., if it's up to work, we will make sure that we provide that food and ensure that they have access to it.
And Miley, what are you guys doing to change the world?
Yeah, before we end, it's Millie. I'm sorry.
I know I kept saying
okay.
That's my mother's name, but someone said Miley, so I've been saying Miley. I don't want to disrespect my mother, but Millie. Thank you. Sorry.
That's fine. That's fine. Well, there's different things, but I want to just explain this. We're working on the Violence Against Women Act to be reauthorized. It needs to be. You have healthy women. Women, we are the center of the family. We organize our family, we organize our community. And the other part is that we're working with, Paku, you reminded us, we're working with the building, the community. We don't call them gardens in Spanish, we call them huertos, the groves. Community groves or family groves. Why? Because they're healthy. We're helping the environment. We're trying to find and go back and make sure that many of our people that have a lot of ancestry knowledge and have practices in terms of not only home remedies, but that can help build a better, healthy human system, well, whatever. But we're calling it the Mother Earth project, and it's a project that there are several funding sources that are very, very much interested in supporting this kind of, because we're working with the environment, making sure that everything that Baku just, I don't want to repeat it, but we're doing that kind of work, and we just finished with talking with Emma about that. But we have a lot of our organizations have that because our families have already growing there, but they need to learn how to build their own business, how to do all this to get better. Thank you.
Paku, Emma, Greg, Millie, Madre, thank you so much for joining us today and for this wonderful discussion. We could have gone on for another hour or two. And thank you for the audience. I'm going to pass it over to Corby Comer.
Thank you, Russell. Thank you, all of our great panelists. And I'm certainly going to say Millie for the rest of my life and never make that mistake again. I couldn't help taking notes and tweeting so many of the powerful and inspirational statements we had in this conversation, which, thanks to everyone who joined today and our colleagues that share our strength, are a feature of all of our conversations on food justice. I invite everyone who joined us today to look for a link to the recording, which we'll have on the Conversations on Food Justice site, part of Food and Society at the Aspen Institute next week, and we will soon have our summary to action. Already Millie and others were saying, here's what we can do, the steps we can take. Greg, Paku, all of them were saying, here's what to do. Emma, so you've made us all want to do something. We'll be able to take action in the summary to action report. Also, please join us for our next conversation, which will be on I think we have a great title, which is American Dreams Deferred: Race, Poverty, and the Barriers to Accessing Social Benefit Programs. So it's race and the social safety net. We're really excited about that. We're looking to have that at the end of February. As always, an inspirational, powerful talk. Thanks to all of our colleagues and our speakers who were generous enough to give us their time. Thank you for being generous enough to give us your time today. And we look forward to seeing you at the next conversation on food justice.